gallery serves as a platform to exhibit contemporary art. We are a learning laboratory for our students, and it's critical that we exhibit and host programming that features professional artists and historians so that faculty can use the gallery as an instructional resource, and our students and the community can experience the artwork in person. Hear the artists speak about their process, their career, and their artistic journey. Today, of course, I'm delighted to introduce Amanda Smith. She is one of the 5 participating artists, and she has large-scale paintings in the front gallery. She's a senior lecturer in painting at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and she earned her MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a BA from the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. She has exhibited and lectured nationally and internationally, including exhibits at Spring Break Art Show in New York, the Rochester Art Center in Minnesota, the Lidi Vokos Art Center in Kansas City, Box 13 Art Space in Houston, the Sheldon in St. Louis, the International Quilt Museum, and Biblioteca Viva Agaña in Santiago, Chile. She's been a visiting artist in many universities, including Temple University, Rome, right? Is that right? That's great. The University of Kansas and the University of South Carolina. And now Parkland College. Smith has also been an artist in residency, and that I always find that fascinating. And one of them was in Iceland called Flyout Tunga. Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts for Arrowmont Pentaculum, and Monsoon Arts in Maine, and the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center in Nebraska City, as well as another Est Nord Est, in Quebec. So really very high caliber of exhibitions and everything like that. So anyway, it's been really fun to meet Amanda and work with her, and so I'm going to let her get started.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction and for organizing the exhibition and the opportunity to speak with you today. And thanks, Katrina, for helping with all of the tech here. This is kind of an unusual and exciting venue, so thanks for coming out for the talk. So as Lisa mentioned, my name is Amanda, and I'm really interested in landscape, particularly how it documents the relation between environment and culture. So the way that environment shapes culture and culture conversely shapes environment. I'm also fascinated by how painting converses kind of back and forth with other media and how it defines itself as distinct from those other media. So in this talk, I'm going to share a few different bodies of work from the past 15 or so years in which I've explored these themes. So I just have to remember to hit both buttons. Okay. My interest in landscape, culture, and that translation between media really cemented for me in grad school. I really like movies and borrowed tons of them from the library during my grad school experience. So my obsession with film crept into my studio practice. I started using cinematic imagery as kind of a point of departure for making paintings. So I began to notice when I was watching movies, I was oftentimes more interested in the presentation of environments and the timing of how space was kind of revealed slowly for you, more so than the story itself. I also found that access to spaces in film was kind of frustrating in that I couldn't choose to linger with a space at my own pace. I couldn't explore it on my own time. And that kind of made me realize that I was trying to look at film the same way that I looked at a painting. I was placing the same expectations on it. So paintings tend to offer you the entirety of their contents all at once, and then that allows you to make decisions about how to spend time with them, how to unpack them, how long you might linger with them. Films, on the other hand, do the opposite. The director paces exactly when and for exactly how long you see various aspects of the film. So my thesis work for grad school kind of ended up being about that idea. the translation between media, and how both cinema and painting strongly influence our cultural imaginations of landscape. In many ways, they are the two most prominent media through which we think about the term landscape, right, or the image of landscape. I was really interested in how the two mediums influence us differently and what we tend to take for granted about their influence. Most of these paintings came about as a combination of collage and diorama of source material that referenced films. So basically, I would spend time at my computer taking stills, lots, like hundreds and thousands of stills from films, and would print off certain images and start to chop them up and piece them together. And I also built kind of small three-dimensional maquettes of spaces. My intent was not so much to copy these films, but to use some of the spatial cues and tropes as a way of making something that was a hybrid of a cinematic space and a painting space. And the stills that I took and worked from were most often establishing and transitional shots. They were never the more iconic or recognizable moments within a film. Since I'm interested in nature and humans' perception of it, I gravitated to films in which the substances or material forces present in a film kind of served as characters or sources of friction or dread. So an obvious example would be the sci-fi thriller The Blob, or films that used natural or environmental elements as allegorical or sometimes literal antagonists. Of course, I also saw the material substances in these films as really similar to paint. So whether those substances were natural, alien, or consumer in the films, they tended to have a material presence that seemed very related to paint and were in circumstances that mirrored the process of making a painting, at least from my opinion. They combined the effort of trying to control the substance while ultimately accepting that the material is going to behave its own way despite your best efforts. So you're always kind of compromising and making do. I followed this trajectory, kind of working from cinematic inspiration, for a few years after grad school, and I began slowly reducing the amount of influence of cinema and increasing the amount of influence of environments from my own personal travel and my immediate surroundings. So the last film in this series that I made a painting from was called Uncle Boonmee Who Can Recall His Past Lives. The film is loosely about family ties and tradition and the transmigration of souls between human generations, but also between species. It was very slow and does not have a clear narrative, and it unfolds like a lush painting. It's a Thai film, so it's also a lot about kind of cultural and political events in Thailand and folklore from the area. It's basically kind of a container for all of these ideas. It's pretty loosely connected, and none of the ideas are ever fully solved or resolved for the audience. So to me, it was a film that kind of behaved more like a painting than a film. I was really taken by the film, so I made this large painting in response. I need to advance that slide. There we go. This time, I wasn't compressing specific film stills, but I was thinking more about the atmosphere, the attitude, and the ambiguity that that film really left with its audience with. And this painting signaled the end of a particular direction in my work, but it will become important in my practice again, so remember it. We will return to it later in this talk. So during this period, which is about the mid-20-teens, I started reevaluating where I was finding my sources and why collage mattered to me as a preparatory process. Up to this point, I used it to combine and construct spaces, but increasingly folks were asking me, if you've already made the collage, why do you need to make the painting, right? It's a really frustrating question to get as an artist, but it's a very fair question. I see some people smiling, so I sense you've maybe heard a similar question before. So I was chewing on that question, and I began to seek opportunities to travel in relationship to my art practice. I went to a residency in West Iceland in summer of 2015, and this experience really altered the way that I approach my work. It was an incredible place. The residency was located on a 20-kilometer plot of land that included a lava field, Iceland's largest lava cave, 2 rivers, a roaring waterfall, a swan pond, and a direct view of a glacier. It had a swamp on top of a hill that you could jump on like a trampoline. It was really bouncy and very fun. And the sun was up most of the day and most of the night. For someone who is interested in slippery, kind of all-at-once experiences, it was heaven. It also led me to ask a new, strange question. What might it mean to mishear a landscape? I came to understand that collage is more than a construction method. It is a rift in perception. My experience in Iceland was one of constantly negotiating my perceptions. Iceland is an actively volcanic Arctic state with dramatic changing weather. It would play tricks on me constantly while I was there, visually, spatially, and audibly. At times, it felt like the environment was building a collage in real time and space by exploiting my perceptions. It would kind of add and remove elements in a blink of an eye, almost faster than I could comprehend them at times. So at the residency, I made a lot of kind of fragment studies of the landscape. Part of that was practical. It was pretty far inland, so basically you had to live out of a backpack. So I wasn't making huge work. And I wondered, while out in this space with all of this kind of audible and visual confusion, what the psychological effect of living in such a disorienting landscape might be, and how it was baked into Icelandic culture, which is really heavily steeped in folklore. Maybe you've heard about this, their sort of interest in hidden folk or elves. So I started reading about early Norse settlers in Iceland. The site where the residency was located was mentioned in the sagas, so it has a really deep historical tradition. And it was mentioned as a site where the legendary outlaw Grettir the Strong committed a murder. So at the time that Grettir was alive, which was around the 10th century, the most severe form of punishment was complete banishment from society, kind of like a living purgatory, so essentially to be left alone in a really harsh, unforgiving land. In the outlaw Grettir's banishment, he developed a crippling fear of the dark. I ended up making a video about this particular lore. The rock where an outlaw dreads the dark is a line taken from W.H. Auden's Letters from Iceland, referring to Grettir the Strong's final home on a crumbling sea cliff. I found Grettir a fascinating character who exhibited kind of a bullish strength and aggression, but paired with the vulnerability of an almost childish fear. I read this character as directly reflected of and built by the landscape, and I also read it as an environmental punishment for human hubris. In the video, the Grettir character shifts between crushing lava rock and caressing it like worry stones. So my residency experience also made me think more about poetic mistranslations. My cohort of residents was international, so we as a group spoke a combination of native French, German, Farsi, Spanish, English, and Icelandic languages. And we all struggled to adequately describe the otherworldly qualities of the land that hosted us in any language. But what resulted was kind of a strange new construction, kind of a poetic mishmash of terms. And it was really exciting. So I started a series of small paintings that I called Misheard Landscapes that had no real end goal, but that used that kind of notion, the notion of mishearing or misunderstanding, as an analog for a way to combine disparate shapes or spaces. It was kind of a provisional process. And all of that work was very energizing, but because it was kind of provisional, it felt to me kind of difficult to resolve or like fully believe in. And that's my own problem. But this led me to a transition, which was also very collage-based, where I started considering painting through an entirely different material discipline. So for years, I lived in Nebraska, and I made many visits to the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln. I've come to acknowledge that some quilts are also functionally really great paintings. And quilts moved from just being a source of inspiration for me to a direct part of my practice in the spring of 2018. I got to know the artist Celeste Butler here. She was a fellow at the Union for Contemporary Art in Omaha. Our work and backgrounds are really pretty different, but our attitudes toward making are really similar. We're both studio rats, and she's a great supporter of other artists in her community. I really respect and identify with this. So when she offered a continuing ed improvisational quilt class at the local community college, I jumped at the chance to learn from her and work with her. So there was a problem. I didn't know how to use a sewing machine, and I don't think she fully understood that when I signed up. But I actually think that flaw is what made the whole experiment work. I never thought about what I was doing as making a quilt, but always as making a painting. And I didn't know for a long time what I could or couldn't actually accomplish in sewing, so I tried any ridiculous idea that I had. And I was informed by years and years of training in painting, but I had a complete beginner's mind in textiles, which that's a combination I recommend you make use of at some point. Be an expert in one thing and a total beginner in another and let them crash together. It's a great experience. So as I was making these works, I was always thinking about how to make fabric or quilt behave like a painting. And this is the work that I made in that class, a reworking of one of my Iceland collages. I found that improvisational piecing made immediate intuitive sense to me, and it related very closely with the kind of collage spatial sensibility that I have in my paintings. I caught the quilting bug pretty bad, but I needed to rapidly get my skills in sewing to catch up with my ideas. So I decided to revisit this painting, I told you I'd be back, and to make a series of at least 10 different quilts reinterpreting it. I chose to do this for a few reasons. The consistency in imagery and composition meant that I could focus my experimentation on construction techniques and material choices, which created kind of a self-imposed crash course in sewing skills. And as I made the works, I thought about them through the lens of a painting process. In addition to strengthening my sewing skills, the repetition of this project allowed me to question and examine what makes something a painting and what makes something particularly not a painting. So this is an installation shot from a show I had at Winona State University in Minnesota, and they let me paint the walls and kind of turn the space into a quilt of sorts. And I think it was a nice hybrid way of getting painting and quilt to really start talking together in space. And since the painting that I was initially revisiting was inspired by a film that included themes of reincarnation, I found quilts to be conceptually relevant as heirlooms. They are objects of comfort, often passed through generations, reappearing in new contexts to be loved by new people. I think of quilts as great objects for time travel. As I embarked on this series called Past Lives, I thought about the relationship between painting and quilts. They're both kind of paradoxical things. Neither are objects exactly, but they're not exclusively images either. Paintings are physical, quilts are physical, okay? So, unlike paintings, quilts can be perceived as primarily functional, and each medium's respective historical place in American culture is pretty different. Painting is considered art with a capital A, while quilt is often thought of as craft, as domestic, and often gendered, and typically is considered tiptoeing into quote-unquote art when stripped of its more functional and gendered contexts and presented on a gallery wall. The scholar Susan Bernick rightly pointed this out, saying, "A quilt is an art object when it stands up like a man." At the same time, I think there is a big interest in the opposite direction from painting. Artists and critics are thinking about a more expanded notion of painting and wonder if and how painting can interface or connect with the world outside of a gallery wall. Actually, I'm going to go back to this for a second. Maybe this is of interest just because we're in a planetarium, but do you see if I can use the pointer here, these two little, I call them eyes. That's the solar eclipse that happened in 2017? It's the image I was able to take from my camera phone. Okay, so these questions and comparisons about painting and quilts were fascinating to me. And as I wrapped up the series of the 10 reinterpretations, this past live series, I began playing around with how these works could take on different forms or start to interact with space in new ways. And I started making these raft-like forms after I deconstructed what kind of felt like a failed attempt at a quilt painting. I always like to say that the painting threw itself a life raft in the process. In this raft, I looked to functional materials of outdoor gear, so things like straps or grommets, ripcords, and used them to become references to painting. So in this case, the cushion seems to be kind of slipping off a cartoonishly loose canvas stretcher. And as I wrapped up the series of these 10 reinterpretations, I started to think about quilt as an object that can speak to or create opportunity to interact with outdoor environments. So while I was at a residency in Quebec, I started taking my quilt works in progress out into the St. Lawrence River to capture some of the changing weather conditions and to kind of think about camouflage and overt visibility in landscape, and to kind of literally absorb some of the residue of my environmental experience in the fiber of these heirloom objects. So at this particular site, it was in Saint Jean Port Joli, which is fairly far east of Montreal. The St. Lawrence River is like half river, half ocean, so it's kind of brackish water. It has a tide and a current, and it's about 20 kilometers wide. So you really it feels like an ocean in some ways. So the conditions change really dramatically from hour to hour and day to day. At another residency in Monson, Maine, I took particular notice of no trespassing signs on my daily walks. They were so frequently posted, sometimes like every 10 feet or so, that they seemed silly. And I started making and posting my own as though they were kind of interrupting my thoughts on these walks, kind of like they were a social media feed in space. So I made my own versions of these signs, and they were kind of like amalgamations of things I was listening to on these walks. Directly following that residency, I started a job at Missouri State University and moved to the Ozarks. The landscape is really interesting. It's wooded and pretty rough, and there is a strong visual presence of hunting, outdoorsmanship, and gun culture in the region. It's the original and corporate home of Bass Pro Shops, which lends a strange and highly refined corporate aesthetic to this outdoorsman culture. All of these things influenced a body of work I made for a solo show at the University of South Carolina, which I called Restless Sleepers. This show was about navigating landscape and forest space, getting lost, interpreting and misinterpreting signs and codes, and the possibilities for utilitarian rest forms like sleeping bags or hammocks to become paintings. While I remain very interested in these themes, I increasingly feel that this particular body of work tipped over the edge for me. It pushed too far outside of painting and kind of stopped being about that as much as I wanted it to be. So I think in retrospect, it served more to help me notice my surroundings in new ways than to be an ongoing generative source of hybrid painting forms. So that brings us to 2020, everyone's favorite year. I mentioned I had just moved to Springfield, Missouri for a teaching job, and in that process bought a house on an acre of land. When COVID lockdown hit, my relationship to landscape turned toward my most immediate surroundings, my backyard and neighborhood, but kind of as a lens for finding something bigger and stabilizing, for like a glimpse at long time. So I put up a quote here by Martin Shaw from a book he wrote during lockdown that was kind of a call back to the beauty and necessity of relating to old stories and myth. So I'll read the quote here. He says, "We are awash with the very power of words, virus, isolate, pandemic, and they point toward very real things. To some degree, we need the organizational harassment of them. But do they grow corn on your tongue when you speak them? Where is the beauty making in all of this?" So I had only read the book last month, but it kind of shook me to my core because it, much more eloquently, summarize the desires and really the needs that I felt during lockdown. The backyard served as a site of reflection and projection, a way to think outside of an immediate, urgent sense of time, and to consider some of the things humans have been perpetually curious about and perpetually in relationship with or in relation to. Martin Shaw declares that even though we are technicians of unimaginable advances, we are growing less literate to interpret a way the earth has always spoken to us, through myth. So in the past, I most often reached for something outside of my personal experience and knowledge, new places, novel materials, almost as a way of traveling. And now I was just looking right outside my back door. What could I learn from painting things that I saw every day, or better yet, the small disruptions in what I saw every day? How could they connect me to a deeper continuity with humanity? My backyard really begged me to pay attention. On walks around my neighborhood, I found myself projecting meaning onto the most ordinary of my surroundings, in this case, litter that I saw fairly often. It was a way to orient myself in this strange isolated period, and maybe to find the reflection of a stranger also living some kind of parallel life in their own isolation. I started thinking through a kind of backyard mythology. In particular, I kept noticing mirroring and twinning in nature. And these moments were feeling pretty portentous. Were these points of mirroring or twinning, were we seeing a reflection of ourselves? Were we actually seeing a disconnection from ourselves? Were these relationships with the past or with our ancestors? So this mirroring and facing was certainly a visual tactic in my work, but I also started to build up like a habitual repetition in the form of rituals in my personal life. They just became a bigger presence. So one ritual was backyard campfires, particularly in conjunction with the full moon. It was a way of keeping time and noticing change that was something separate from digital devices, from Zoom meetings, from calendars and to-do lists. It was a way of enjoying the company of a few people, the plants, and the nocturnal animals that wandered into the yard, and to notice the predictable and the unprecedented aspects of seasonal change. It was a way of listening and of imagining. So the title for this work comes from a poem by Eric Campbell. When was the last time that someone read something aloud to you, like from a book? I'm going to read aloud to you right now. Why not? It's fun. It's a great poem. So this is, the Village Green Preservation Society considers how the cartographers conspired. An answer. Given the state of maps then, it is hardly surprising that so many ships failed to return. William Manchester. Scientists around several tables decided the planet Pluto isn't. This is how the cosmos is nudged, by naming. Why maps are complicated, then discarded. It's nonsense to think of Dante nowadays and where he happened to place his hells, or how the 7 visible spheres became crowns for ancient kings. And if the Vatican is correct, the Virgin, ascending at the speed of light, hasn't left our galaxy yet. This is why the universe swallows both regular and immaculate conceptions and burps without saying excuse me. Still, we look up often and constellate stars because one must constellate something and read them like tea leaves, because magnetic north, among other things, or other fixed things, is moving. Confession. I love those early maps of the unfinished, half-assed world, unknown places populated by crypto-anthropological creatures drawn more carefully than continents, and the pirate syntax of here there be monsters. Marco Polo was correct to see Chinese unicorns instead of rhinoceroses, and never mentioned drinking tea. This is the lot for most mysteries, always pushed to our peripheries. Last week, Google reduced our hometowns to fields and streets and perfect squares. Unless we close our eyes, we can't find where we used to be anywhere. So I think he, like Martin Shaw, sees the value in these cultural and mythological structures, however absurd, because they involve imagination and relating, particularly through time and to the earth. So this is a painting of both my backyard from my studio window, where I paid attention to the phases of the moon and many other things, and my shower curtain, which just has a decorative graphic depiction of these phases. I superimpose these images together to create an image that is slippery and references some older forms of almanac. So on the left here is an example of a clog almanac from rural England around 1600, and the right is an almanac description of a total lunar eclipse in 1504. And here's an image that just gives you an install shot for some context about the scale of some of these works. So this backyard series has led me to think about the kinds of spaces and technologies that humans make to control interaction with nature and history. And this is where my work is currently headed. So this painting, which is included in the show here at Parkland, is about one such mediated space. It's the classic in-town nature preserve. So this painting was inspired by an experience I had at the Springfield Nature Center. I had recently been on a night forest walk in Quebec, which was led by a forest guide. And in that walk, though we were in pretty dense forest and well after dark, our eyes adjusted and we could see fairly well without flashlights. So thinking of that experience, my partner Josh and I planned a night hike in our nature center in town. So I'm not sure what happened exactly, if it was because the nature preserve was in town, so there's like that little ambient, umbrella of city light above it, but our eyes never did adjust. I didn't bring my phone, and Josh's battery died right as it got dark, so we were working our way through the trails largely on memory. And at one point, we heard this sudden, really loud clattering. You could kind of feel a rustle, and there was this horrible kind of musky chemical fear smell. All of these senses indicated that something fairly large was moving towards us, but we couldn't see it. And it's a strange experience to have so many senses giving you input and to realize just how much you rely on sight for final confirmation. It took many seconds, which felt much longer, to finally piece together the silhouette of a buck who we had startled under a plank bridge that crossed over a stream. So the buck was down at the stream and working its way up. I wanted to make a painting about that experience, that kind of wild fear of delayed confirmation, but I couldn't quite figure out how to make a painting about not being able to see something. So I made this instead, which refers a little bit more to the eeriness of trail cam vision and maybe our obsession of knowing what happens in the night, but being at kind of removed from it, seeing it through a screen. In addition to the Mediated Nature Center, I also, when I was in Springfield, lived at a point of historical convergence. So my backyard is right where that red dot is up at the top. I was a few short miles from a major Civil War battlefield. It was the first conflict west of the Mississippi, and I think the second battle of the Civil War. And my yard was also right on the Wire Road, which was the major kind of communication transport line during that time, and the Trail of Tears. So there was a preserved, or at least demarcated section of the Trail of Tears 3 blocks from my house. It kind of tunneled like an alleyway between housing developments, so you would see gardens and backyard trampolines and homeowners carefully applying Roundup at the borders to keep the trail's weeds from disturbing their turf grass. And the section of this trail terminated at a Walmart parking lot. The whole time I lived in Missouri, I felt unsettled. I'm not sure if the feeling was related to the kind of history of misery of that location. Maybe that's also the name of the state. Just kidding. But, or that the divided and contested political positions of Missouri during the Civil War still seemed to remain unresolved in the identity of the area to this day. It was always strange to visit these sites, because they were parks at this point. And especially during COVID, these well-manicured spaces promoted recreation, and even more so when they became replacements for gyms during lockdown. So all of these circumstances have led me to pay attention to the ground, to really stare at it and to try and listen to it. Painting is a great excuse for this, right? Long-looking, slow-looking. But so is mowing an acre with a push mower. This is a painting of a common weed called broadleaf plantain. I had plenty in my yard, and I bet you probably do too. One of its colloquial folk names is white man's footstep because it was not native to the Americas and came with European colonists. It tends to crop up in soil that has been disturbed, so it became kind of a visual and environmental record of settlement. I'm learning things like this and considering more about the very anthropocentric and sometimes polarized language we use when we talk about plant life. So before I end, in case you were wondering, where'd all the quilt stuff go? It's still percolating. About 2 years ago, I was invited to participate in a series of exhibitions in Japan centered around Shiro-ishi washi, which is a historically significant paper that's produced in a single workshop in the Miyagi Prefecture, and it's made from mulberry fibers. So this exact paper is what the Instrument of Surrender that ended World War II was signed on, but it has this huge history in Japan of being traditionally used in a variety of ways, one of those being a material for creating paper clothing. So this paper essentially you can treat with a yam starch, and it softens the paper. It's still pretty crisp, but it gives it a little bit more of a drape, gives it durability, and also makes it maybe not waterproof, but water resistant. So since it behaves like both a painting substrate and a fabric, I've used it in a couple of works in which I've painted, pieced, and quilted, and I'll be going to Japan for a residency this winter to continue developing my relationship with this material approach. So with that, that's the end of my lecture, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you for your time and attention. The work that we were just looking at, this is one of the smaller quilts, so I think you can just physically see it a little bit more. It is one of the few times I've used more of like a radial approach to making the quilting, right? So the sandwiching together of the layers. Whereas something like this, I think I'm kind of thinking about like either a grid structure that is just there to unify, but not necessarily fully interact with the image, or maybe depending on the scale of the image, it kind of looks like fencing or some type of netting or container too. So with these works, I didn't go into great detail about them, but they were sort of thinking about those no trespassing signs that I encountered in Monson, Maine. And those just kind of like entered my brain because I'm from the Midwest. We don't have lots of those. We don't have many forests. So they were unusual to me, right? Whereas they were completely mundane to that community. So we had an open studio where I was showing, some of the works that I had made in the residency. And some folks were sort of surprised that I noticed or was paying attention to these signs. But there was a couple who came up to me and asked about the work, and they said they were really compelled by it because they had just had a situation which kind of explained why there were so many of these signs, almost so many that people couldn't see them. Their niece had recently been killed by a hunter on her own property, and all of the political coverage, like in the newspaper, really used language, like, well, she wasn't dressed appropriately, so she was asking for it, which is language we've heard in other situations when we're dealing with women, right? So they were kind of like excited that I was paying attention to it, or just it was a point of dialogue. And I had a friend in Omaha who had a similar kind of like racially based property stand your ground interaction. It was just something that was coming up a lot. So I also think my interests were really political, and I personally don't always think art is the greatest way to deal with politics. It's almost too indirect. So between the sort of like losing sight of the material process as it relates to painting and maybe an over interest in subject matter, I think that's where it kind of tipped too far for me. And I'm not a sculptor, and some of this started getting a little sculptural. So
Great, thank you so much.
thank you.